Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Wow, we're going to continue our discussion of Julius Evola. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 sessions left. We'll have today's and tomorrow's, and then next weekend will be the last 2 sessions. So the next 4 sessions or classes are entirely devoted to writings from the anthology bearing the title The Bow and the Club, also published by Arctos. I would like to point out that this anthology, unlike the Metaphysics of Power, was compiled by Evola himself. The Metaphysics of Power was not. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, that the selection and arrangement of this is not something, is not the product of someone else. It is indeed the doing of Evola himself. This is the translation by Sergio Knipe, I'm not sure, Knipe. It's Arctos Publishing. Again, that's London 2018. So today, I think there's going to be a lot to discuss. So let's just begin. We'll be looking at the first essay today, which is the civilization of space and the civilization of time. Then, according to the syllabus, we will move to the second essay in the book, The Bow and the Club, which is The Breed of the Evasive Man. I found that to be very eloquent. Then we will skip the third essay and go to the fourth, very controversial, I think, in the light of not just the climate in the United States, but in the whole world. And that is Negrified America. Okay, those are Evola's words, not mine. We're simply discussing Evola here, and we're not necessarily advocating or not advocating his ideas. I'm simply of the opinion that one must read Evola and come to one's own conclusions. So that third essay, which we will look at today, is very closely tied in with Evola's notion of race. He authored extensive works on race, which we will mention at the appropriate time. But let us not get ahead of things, and let's just begin with the first essay, The Civilization of Space and the Civilization of Time. Now, I think it's important to bear in mind 2 other essays of Evola when reading The Civilization of Space and the Civilization of Time, and that is the essays which we looked at, I think it was last time, namely On the Decline of the Idea of the State, a very extensive essay, and his companion essay entitled The Reconstruction of the Idea of the State. So in those 2 essays, he deals with a certain aspect of the history of course, he's dealing with the state, but the history of civilizations. And he thinks that the most significant factor or element in the decline of the concept of the state, and also concordantly its possible reconstruction, even if that is only a theoretical or hypothetical exercise, that in all of those, the key factor or element is what he calls the regression of the castes. And so once again, we have this idea, this very ancient doctrine, which is nowadays mainly identified with what is known as Hinduism, but what Evola argued was in fact a feature found in all societies of a traditional, with a capital T, a traditional character, namely the highest caste, an ascetic kind of caste, a caste given to the practice of ascesis, a kshatriya or warrior caste, a merchant caste, and a caste of slaves or serfs or servants. And it is the regression of these castes that is the most salient feature for Evola in his analysis of the decline of the concept of the state. The most salient feature of the degenerative, almost necrotic and entropic force of the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, what is known as the Age of the Wolf for the Nordic tradition. But in this essay, the civilization of space and the civilization of time, he approaches traditional civilizations from another perspective, namely that of space and time, as is indicated by the title. So he is contrasting traditional civilizations with modernity, so-called modern civilization, the latter being dominated by time and the former being dominated by space. So these ancient primordial civilizations for Evola are characterized by their stability. And this stability is embodied in immutability rather than what Evola calls immobility. And with the passage of time and the continuous, not really incremental, it may have been increment in the sense that incremental has the sense of slowly, but shall we say gradual, or with the passage of time, what has emerged in the modern period is a so-called civilization, a way of living which is characterized by the mathematization, I would say, this is not a phrase of Evola, the mathematization and linearization of time and space, both. Now, here also we can see the obvious, well, it's only obvious if you've read, but we can see, if we have read, the influence of René Guénon here as well, especially his work, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. So let us see how all of that is expressed in this very nice brief essay of Evola, The Civilization of Space and Time. He commences the essay by saying, "The traces left by certain great primordial civilizations," and then he has a bunch of parentheticals set off by dashes. So the traces left by certain great primordial civilizations, dash, traces left often only in stone, dash, possesses a significance which is rarely perceived, full stop. Looking upon the remains of the archaic Greco-Roman world and beyond, another dash, of Egypt, of Persia, of China, down to the last emerging and immobile vestiges of worlds submerged and swept away, those mysterious megalithic monuments scattered across deserts, wild areas, and forests, then another dash, or to consider the opposite limit on the chronological spectrum of history down to certain expressions of the European Middle Ages, then dash, and he gets back, and he says, looking upon all of this, one wonders whether the miraculous survival of such testimonies may not stand as a symbol, rather than simply as the consequence of a lucky combination of external circumstances. So he's very impressed in all of these little dashed remarks he has of the vestiges. Perhaps we might, instead of vestiges, say the rather impressive and dramatic, imposing structures or archaeological remains, of which the most emblematic are perhaps those of ancient Egypt, namely the pyramids, not only the pyramids of Giza, but other pyramids, Saqqara, etc., other Egyptian so-called funerary or temple complexes. And I lived for a long time in Egypt, and I can testify to and bear witness to their utterly imposing character. I mean, to stand in the shadow of the pyramids is an experience which no one can ever forget. At the same time, we have other vestiges of ancient civilizations, such as in Mesoamerica, Mayan and Aztec and Inca monuments, ruins, remains, Stonehenge, even more recent structures, other very imposing structures, although they are less well preserved in those from ancient Mesopotamia, which are found in the modern day nation of Iraq. And the examples could be multiplied quite extensively. So he's referring to these immobile vestiges. And he says that when we look upon all of this, we can wonder whether this, what he characterizes a miraculous survival of these ruins, as these vestiges, as he calls them, and we may ask ourselves, are they not perhaps symbolic of something, rather than simply just the result of fortuitous events of a purely natural, geologic, or whatever, or meteorological character? Now, he argues that this impression that they are not merely fortuitously there, that the fact that they have survived into our times, but that they are symbolic, that impression, he says, is further strengthened if we bother to think about it a bit. That he says, if we consider, when we consider the general character of the life of those civilizations, all the ones he enumerated, to which most of these traces belong, which is to say the general character of what may be described as traditional life. Now, he identifies this traditional life, interestingly enough, chiefly with the East. Excuse me. Interesting, he doesn't dwell on, say, the ancient Maya. He's concerned with the East. It is chiefly the East which this traditional world brings to mind. And by way of example, he refers to two civilizations which preserved many aspects and features of a living tradition with a capital T, namely China and India. Consider what China and India were like until relatively recent times, or indeed Japan until an even more recent past. Generally speaking, the further back we go in time, the more vital, universal, and powerful we find this kind of civilization to be. So much so that the East alone must be regarded as that part of the world in which, thanks to lucky circumstances, traditional civilizations survive longer and develop better than anywhere else. So I think he's alluding to the fact, which Genon also refers to in The Reign of Quantity, that the most striking degenerative forces and corrosive and subversive influences of the Kali Yuga arose in the West, in Europe. By way of example, or by way of a few examples, the French Revolution did not occur in Kyoto, to state the obvious, or the Protestant Reformation is not a Buddhist or Chinese phenomenon. Again, to state the obvious. So these two very striking examples of the corrosive tendencies of the Kali Yuga emerged as historical events and processes, part of this cycle, geographically speaking, in the region of the world known as the West. He continues, it is as though the rule of time were partly suspended in civilizations of this sort. So here he's referring to the greater resilience, I suppose, or robustness of tradition with a capital T in terms of its very late survival into really just the beginning of the 20th century. They seem to have been born not so much in time as in space. They possess an atemporal character. And he thinks it's he considers it quite remarkable that these civilizations, with their immutability, their resistance to change, their atemporality, so to speak, is reflected also in the sheer and here immobility, I would say, is appropriate. The sheer resilience of these stone monuments. He says, in fact, they are civilizations whose very material vestiges, such as the pyramids, for example, are apparently destined to outlast all the modern world's monuments or idealistic creations. For the latter hardly have the power to endure more than half a century. The words progress and dynamism mean nothing in relation to them, but a mere subjection to contingency, to the movement of incessant change, of a rapid rise and a sharp and equally rapid decline. These processes do not obey any truly organic inner law. They are not enclosed within any limits, but they acquire momentum of their own, so that they ultimately carry away the very people who have triggered them. Such is the distinguishing feature of this different world in all of its sectors. Yet despite all this, these processes have been turned into a kind of criterion for measuring everything which ought to be described as a civilization in an eminent sense, within the framework of a historiography marked by arrogant and disparaging value judgments of the kind already indicated. So here he remarks on in the next paragraph, the error of mistaking immobility in a civilization with a traditional orientation with immutability. And he thinks that the term immutability is more appropriate. Why? Now, here he introduces the notion of being. I think that's very interesting. He says those civilizations were civilizations of being. They showed their strength precisely in their identity, in their triumph over becoming. So he's contrasting being with becoming, and I think he's identifying being. I don't think he's speaking of the metaphysical notion of being qua being or existence, but this embodiment or personification of immutability as opposed to becoming, occurrence in time, being subject to temporality and the decay which goes with temporality. So he says they showed their strength precisely in their identity and their triumph over becoming, over history, change, and the amorphous flow of things. I think that's a very nice turn of phrase, the amorphous flow of things. These civilizations plunged deep beyond the shifting and treacherous waters, and in the deep, they firmly rooted themselves. And now he really brings all of this to a head in a very nice italicized phrase on the first paragraph of the next page, page 3. The opposition between modern civilizations and traditional ones may be summarized as follows, and this is italicized. Modern civilizations devour space, whereas traditional civilizations devoured time. I think that's a very interesting, almost aphoristic or even oracular utterance, which encapsulates a great truth, in as much as modern so-called civilization does indeed devour space. If you look around the world, the complete and total, the totalizing destruction of the natural order of virgin nature, of encroachment upon, let's say, wild domains and habitats, is very much a salient feature of modern civilization. Modern civilizations also, according to Evola, are, as he says, dizzying in their fever for movement and for the conquest of space. Now, this conquest of space, of course, is a result also of expansion of the built environment of of the almost, shall we say, cancerous growth of cities and human habitations, but also the mechanical means, he would say, that goes with all of that, especially transportation and other inventions and application of technique, modern contrivances that reduce all distances and shorten all intervals. So it's not just, let's say in the beginning, it probably would have been the locomotive, the steam engine, the train, cars, airplanes, modern kinds of ships, by which I mean seagoing vessels, and then all of these means of communication, such as the one we're using now, some kind of video phone, right? Telephones, cell phones, and so on and so on and so on. So all distances, so space has been devoured. Distances and have been all but reduced. Intervals of time have also all been gone. You know, what's a good example of that? Instant messaging, not just email, but, you know, things like WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and, I don't know, Parler. And I mean, there's so many, right, that enable you to immediately communicate in some way or send some you know, files to another human being, and then expect an almost instantaneous response. So this frenzy, this frenetic pace is characteristic of modern civilization, and all of this is absent from traditional civilizations. There's a very nice phrase here. He says, elaborating upon all these themes, this is a frenzied need. Oh, wait, sorry. So he talked about the means to reduce all distances, shorten all intervals, and contract into a sense of ubiquity whatever is scattered across a multitude of places. New sentence. This is a frenzied need for possession, a dark angst towards all that is detached, isolated, deep, or remote, an impulse to expand, circulate, associate with others, and find oneself in any which place, anywhere except within oneself. I'm also struck by the obsession that people have with their telephones, especially when they're sitting alone somewhere or in a line waiting for something. The point is the phone is always with them and they're always glued to the phone, to the screen. And it's as though people simply do not have the ability anymore to simply sit in silence and be at one with oneself. All of this is exacerbated, according to Evola, by science and technology. Not just in terms of these inventions, but in terms of the mindset engendered by science and technology. It gives rise to what he calls an irrational existential impulse. And that science and technology, we might even call it scientism and technologism, strengthen and fortify this irrational existential impulse. And he identifies this modern spirit very much with the American spirit, which I think is quite interesting. So all of this he characterizes as a kind of Western Faustianism is the phrase that he uses. You'll be familiar in literature with the notion of Faust. There's the figure of Dr. Faustus in Goethe as a character. There's also in the work of, I believe it was Christopher Marlowe. He also has a Faust character, a Dr. Faustus, a person who, through a kind of hypertrophy of the intelligence of the rational faculty, emblematic of modern man, seeks to know everything in a sort of demonic way. And anyhow, Evola characterizes all of this as a kind of Western Faustianism. And he sees this technocratic worldview as being formulated within what he calls the framework of a degenerated messianism. So indeed, there is a notion of modern science and technology as a kind of messiah or savior, as a kind of panacea solution to all problems. In other words, that all aspects of human existence are reduced to merely problems of technique and of the application of science. In contrast to all of this, Evola says that traditional civilizations were dizzying, as he puts it, in their stability, in their identity, in their subsisting in an unwavering and changeless fashion in the midst of the current of time and history. So much so that they even succeeded in lending sensible, tangible expression to eternity. They stood as islands or bastions in time. Operating within them were forces that consumed time and history. For this reason, it is incorrect to say that they were, past tense. It would be more correct to say that they quite simply are. So on the one hand, though Evola acknowledges the Kali Yuga, and in fact, its increasing speed, its dizzying pace, it's careening toward the end point. But within all of that, the older civilizations, despite being civilizations of the Kali Yuga, still managed in some sense to, as he put it, devour time. And this is, again, embodied and reflected in their vestiges, these architectural remains that we can still see in many places today. So he elaborates upon this further, And he introduces a kind of mythological image. He says that this idea on page 4, moreover, corresponds perfectly to the image of the double perspective provided by an ancient traditional teaching. The immobile land moves and withdraws from whomever goes with the waters, while the waters move and withdraw from whomever firmly resides in the immobile land. So there is this symbolism that, land, the shore, is immobile and embodies immobility, but that immobile land itself seems to move away and withdraw from those who submerge themselves in the water. The idea of the waters symbolizing temporality. Within this mythological teaching of the immobile land and the swirling waters of temporality, he says that if one understands this image by viewing it in relation not to the physical plane but to the spiritual plane, one thereby perceives the correct hierarchy of values. Thus we cast our gaze beyond the horizon which confines our contemporaries. What seemed to be past becomes present by virtue, he says, of an essential relating of historical and hence contingent forms to meta-historical contents. What has been referred to as static proves to be overflowing with a dizzying life. The others, they are the fallen, those who have lost their center. Changism, historicism, evolutionism, and so on all seem like the thrills of the shipwrecked, truths applying to whatever flees. And then there's a quotation from something in French. You can read the footnote. It's taken from a French essay by someone named Georges Bernanos. And it simply is a phrase that says, alas, which says, from what are you fleeing, you fools? Alas, you are fleeing from yourselves. So all of this obsession with change, with historicism, evolutionism, etc. This is like people who are overwhelmed, and shipwrecked, and they're just trying to really run away from themselves. He says that all of this, to whatever flees, to whatever lacks inner consistency, and ignores what this means, or even what the origin of all elevations and achievements is. By such achievements, I mean here not merely an intangible and often invisible spiritual culmination, but achievements which rather express themselves through events, epic deeds, and the cycles of civilizations, which even in their silent and scattered stone vestiges seem to adumbrate something supratemporal and eternal. So for Evola, the traditional civilizations were also, even though they devoured time, or I should say that because of their having devoured time, so to speak, their atemporality, because of that, they were also able to effectively act within history. And it is thus that their artistic and architectural creations, which are almost always anonymous, he says. I think that's very interesting. There's an essay in René again on the importance of anonymity in traditional art. But that these creations of theirs, these monolithic buildings and so forth, are almost an extension, he says, of elemental forces. If you've just joined us, we are on page 5 of The Bow and the Club. The essay we are looking at is The Civilization of Space and the Civilization of Time. So now Evola is moving towards a conclusion, and he says, finally, the final point that he wants to make is that we should never forget that traditional civilizations did not have a linear notion of time and space. What I spoke of at the beginning of this discussion, the modern idea of the mathematization and linearization of time and space. So this notion of linearization, which goes with mathematization as well, because modern mathematics envisions the numbers as a line, the real numbers on a line. And they call this the continuum. And they identify time with this as well. And if you make a coordinate axes, then you have the modern mathematical notion of space, which goes back to which goes back to René Descartes. So the traditional civilizations did not have an irreversible linear conception of time, but a cyclical and periodical one. Now I'm just going to go ahead a little bit. There is an important footnote here. I'm not going to read it out. He mentions a few important thinkers in the main text, someone named Hubert, someone named Maus, and someone named Eliade. I don't know who the first two are beyond what's written in the footnote, but Eliade is very important. That's Mircea Eliade, Romanian. Something of a traditionalist, not really a traditionalist, I think, with a capital T like Guénon was, or like Evola was. Also someone who was politically probably on the right. But an extremely important historian and scholar of comparative religions. He has very famous books, such as he has a very famous study of yoga called Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom. He has something which even to this day is regarded as a seminal study of shamanism. But the work which, by his own admission, he regarded as his very best was something called Cosmos and History. I think it was published under two different titles, and the later edition has both. It's Cosmos and History, the Myth of the Eternal Return. And it is a discussion of the notion of cyclical time. And I should point out that Eliade was in correspondence for a while, I think, with Guénon, and he may well have been in touch with Evola as well. I don't quite remember, but it's yeah, I think, but don't quote me on that. But definitely he was in touch with Guénon. So traditional civilizations did not have a linear concept of time, but a cyclical, periodical one. And their whole civilization, in terms of its rites and rituals and cultus, was also connected with a symbolic notion of time. And it's not just seasons, but suffice it to say that every tradition with a capital T has a kind of sacred or liturgical, for want of a better term, calendar or rituals which are timed symbolically as the year commences. Anyhow, so these customs, rites, institutions, etc., from these traditional civilizations, they reveal a constant intention to bring time back to its origins. That is to say, to the origin, once the cycle commenced, which means destroying everything, Evola says, that represents mere becoming. Remember, he said that traditional civilizations were civilizations of being. So it means destroying everything that represents mere becoming, curbing it or making it express or reflect supra-historical, sacred, or metaphysical structures, often connected to myth. It was in such terms as a mobile image of eternity. Now that's in quotes. The mobile image of eternity, or the moving image of eternity, is a quotation from, if you are not aware, and there is no footnote here, of Plato in the Timaeus. In other words, he calls time the moving image of eternity, or a mobile image of eternity. So it was in such terms as a mobile image of eternity that time acquired value and meaning, not as history. So another characteristic of the modern world is the tyranny, what I call the tyranny of history. This kind of obsession with historicism, with written records, with the march of merely mundane temporal events, especially those of a political and economic, and now increasingly social character. So I have in mind political history, economic history, social history. These are terms which anyone who's acquainted with modern academic history, the modern academic or subject of professional history, professional historians will be aware of. Traditional civilizations did not have that kind of attitude toward time. So these rituals, these customs, these rites of traditional civilizations had as their goal the destruction of time, a reenactment, as it were, a going back to the origin. And returning to the origins, continues Evola, meant renewing oneself, drawing upon the spring of eternal youth, and confirming one's spiritual stability against temporality. The great cycles of nature encourage such an attitude. So spring, summer, autumn, winter, the spring equinox, the autumnal equinox, the summer solstice, the winter solstice. The great cycles of nature, again, as he says, encouraged such an attitude. The historical awareness that is inseparable from the situation of modern civilizations only seals this fracture, this fall of man into temporality. Yet it is presented as one of the conquests of the last mankind, which is to say of what he calls crepuscular mankind. There's some footnotes here which we can look at. So I think this is quite interesting up to this point. And I think that there are some interesting observations that I could make from an Islamic point of view in reference to the Islamic tradition. In Islamic philosophy, there are there's more than one work or treatise by an Islamic philosopher bearing the title Al-Mabda wal-Ma'ad, or the origin and the return. And origin and return in these treatises has a cosmological, but I would say also a temporal notion, the notion of manifestation, the notion of procession and return, of recession or regression, or going back or returning to the origin. And also the traditional esoteric commentary or exegesis of the sacred text of the Quran is known as, in Arabic, as Tawil. And Tawil is a word which means to go back to the first, to the awwal, to the origin. Now, I don't really want to get too much off the topic. I simply want to mention this maybe as a footnote, as an aside. But this is the ideas which we just looked at from Evola are extremely important in Islamic thought, Islamic philosophy, especially as among the 12 or Shia Muslims. And this is a dimension of Islam, this notion of going back to the origin of Ta'wil, which was studied in great depth and with great insight and perception by the French Orientalist Henry Corbin, Henri Corbin. Corbin is Corbin. So he has a number of books such as Avicenna and the Visionary Recital. He has another book, Temple and Contemplation. Another book is The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism. The Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. These are extremely important and well-known works by him. He even has a book on cyclical time. It's called Cyclical Time and Ismaili Gnosis. These are all translated into English. Unfortunately, his magnum opus, a 4-volume work, which was called On Iranian Islam, remains in French. So Corbin looked at these ideas in great detail. And I think that's a remarkable resonance, I would call it, with the writing, with the observations of Evola here in this essay. It leads me to wonder if Evola was aware of the writings of Corban. Maybe he was. I really don't have an answer to that question. So all of this is already very profound, and we still haven't gotten to the end of the essay. We're almost there. But just as he's winding up the essay, he brings up, I think, something which most modern readers would find pretty controversial. And here he is turning to the discussion of certain modern discoveries, which presumably, he says, fall under so-called scientific objectivity, but which he thinks that even though he doesn't deny these discoveries, he thinks that they lack a greater sort of metaphysical significance, which the older theories did. And he has in mind specifically the heliocentric theory of the planets associated with the name of Nicholas Copernicus. Now, I want to make it clear that Evola is not saying that Copernicus's theory or discovery is false, nor is he, in case anyone should make this kind of a leap, some sort of advocating some sort of a flat Earth position. He's not going there either. He's saying that with the Copernican discovery, just the last sentence on page 6 extends on over to page 7. With the Copernican discovery, it ceased to be true that the Earth is the firm and immobile center of the heavenly bodies, and it became true that the Earth moves and, following its own law, travels through cosmic space, an irrelevant part of a dispersed or indefinitely expanding universe. It seems highly significant that this discovery occurred more or less in the age of the Renaissance and of humanism, which is to say, in the age of the most crucial upheavals and the emergence of a new civilization, whose individuals were progressively to lose all connections with what is and to fall away from all forms of spiritual centeredness in their adoption of the perspective of becoming, of history, of transformation, of the uncontrollable and unpredictable current of life. So, although he does not deny that this is a legitimate scientific discovery, nevertheless, he sees it as an upheaval, a kind of symbolic upheaval in the worldview of traditional peoples, traditional civilizations, in which not only is the Earth the center of the universe, but man is the center of the universe. And that these wanderers, which is what the word planet means in the original Greek, and so that includes the sun as well as the moon, as wanderers, in other words, heavenly bodies, which from the perspective of a person on the earth seem to go around it, are observed, in fact, to go around it. And with that loss or discrediting of this geocentric perspective, human beings themselves ceased to be centered. And I think it's also important, although he does not in any way touch on this, that this is also the view and approach of a traditional science like that of astrology. Astrology is a symbolic science, and if you eliminate that symbolism, you really don't have astrology anymore. I think it's also worth pointing out that the notion of heliocentricity, and I realize that what I'm going to say is maybe could be potentially controversial, but the idea of heliocentricity was not at all unknown to the ancients. There is the ancient view of the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos. In fact, he had some kind of a heliocentric doctrine. And this contention of mine, namely of the ancient knowledge of heliocentrism, was examined at length by the mathematician and historian of astronomy who was Dutch, named Van der Waarden. Van der Waarden has a very important paper on this, which appeared in an anthology edited by George Saliba of, I don't know if he's still at New York University, but at the time he was, maybe he's at Columbia now, of papers on the history of astronomy, published, edited by George Saliba with the title From Equant to Different. And I have it over here on my shelf. So Copernicus was just, maybe rediscovering an idea. And then, so, well, why wasn't this idea widespread? I am of the view, which is, if I'm not mistaken, also held by Sayyid Hussein Nasr, a traditionalist writer, contemporary, that this doctrine of heliocentrism was more of an esoteric teaching and it was not widely disseminated. All right, so Evola says this is not the only symbolic upheaval that could be mentioned in this connection. With regard to the example just adduced, the Copernican revolution, one point is worth noting. In the traditional world, no so-called objective truth was granted importance. Truths of this sort might be taken into account, but only secondarily, according to their actual relativity on the one hand and to their human value on the other, ever bearing in mind criteria of what would be opportune for the general way of perceiving things. A traditional theory about nature may have been quote-unquote wrong from the point of view of modern science, and that too at a given stage of development, he says. Yet, its value, the reason why it was chosen, notice he says chosen, lay in its sustainability as a means of expressing something true on a different and more interesting level. I think the fact that he says chosen may indicate that he was aware of this idea of ancient heliocentrism. For example, he continues, the geocentric theory grasped an aspect of sensible reality that might serve as a support for a truth of a different sort, an unassailable truth, namely the truth regarding being, spiritual centeredness, as the principle governing the true essence of man. So he sums that all up there and says that, if there's going to be any kind of a change, any kind of redressing of this regressive movement of the Kali Yuga, it has to be on the individual level and represent an interchange of what he calls polarity within the individual man himself. And here he uses what I think is, I have to differ with him. I think this was a bad choice of words. He says that this change may be described as a metanoia, and I wouldn't have used that if I were him. Metanoia as a term is very much tied up with Christianity, and it really has the sense of repentance. Although in the original Greek, it doesn't mean that. It has more the sense of a turning around, a changing of one's mind, a shift of perspective, maybe I would have called a reorientation, and I wouldn't have used the word metanoia. So this kind of change of orientation is how he concludes this essay, namely that one has to bring about a change of orientation from space and the devouring of space, the totalization of space, a hegemonic devouring of the natural order, and somehow reverse the temporal flow within oneself and effectively, so to speak, devour time. And I will conclude a discussion of that essay there, and we can open it up for a little bit of discussion if you like. And either way, if you will just excuse me for a moment, it is getting dark. I must turn on the light in this room. Very well then.
Yeah. So I think I like this essay like for the same reasons you said. The what and I think that definitely the idea of stability across time is I think like in the most ideal sense what civilizations kind of aim for even if they don't know it. Like the
Yeah.
most you measure success by stability, I can agree with that. But at the same time, I think there's also the flip side, which I'm sure Evola knows or like knew, I guess, and he
Mhm.
might have written about it somewhere else. But the flip side is if something is too stable, it gets to kind of degenerate, even if the form is the same, like form in the loose sense of like,
Yeah.
keeping the same rituals, but still degenerating in a certain way. Like I'm thinking of, you know, uh, in that case, the long lasting is not necessarily the measure of success because things can kind of have the same government type, but the spiritual, I guess, spiritual race is how Evola might say it. The stock of the people might get worse even if the government type is the same. So I
Yeah.
think that's the danger of emphasizing longevity, which is not what Evola is doing. He's more emphasizing the kind of uh, uh I guess
Immutability.
the
Mm.
yeah the civilizational spirit or something like that, but
Oh,
just because he was highlighting some of the ones that have survived until now, if someone else with a bit less if someone else were to read this, the criteria for success might not be understood completely. For example, in the another session we talk about like imperium and how that relates to
yeah.
like the heroic spirit of the warrior. It's not necessarily true that the most long-lasting civilization will also have that same spirit of heroism, because what if they sacrifice that heroism for stability, which I would say could be the case in some of the more like conformist civilizations that have existed. So I think that's an example of how in one essay Evola emphasizes one good thing and in another he emphasizes another a different type of good thing that traditional civilizations had.
Yes, well, it seems to me that this essay is kind of an extended meditation upon an encounter, whether actual or imagined, given his condition of paralysis, with the imposing monuments of the ancient civilizations which he mentioned. And to state the obvious, when one is contemplating these, what he says in no uncertain terms are vestiges of ancient civilizations, it indicates that those civilizations, despite their immutability and their having overcome space and devoured time, nevertheless died and died out. So that's inevitable. So I don't know that he's necessarily denying that, but I think he's looking at the notion of a kind of immutability, and I would even say a kind of how shall I, intransigent devotion to principles of a transcendent order. And that is what he is contrasting with with their complete absence in what is called modern civilization, in a complete absence of principle and amorphousness and an utter lack of devotion to anything enduring and principial and transcendental. So I think that was really the point that he was trying to make.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense because was it him or Gunan who said that
Mhm.
traditionalism is like worship, continuing a fire, not worshiping the ashes? That's very famous, right? I forgot which one it was.
Oh
Some
no,
kind
I'm
of
not sure. Yeah, I
it
don't
was
think
some kind
I
of
haven't
quote
heard
like
that
that.
before.
I heard, well, I'm sure it was a big thinker, but they said that the point of traditionalism is to continue carry on lighting a fire rather than worshiping ashes. So I thought that was a famous quote by one of the writers of the movement. It
Mhm.
might have been either of them or it might have been someone else who's summarizing the
Right.
point. But in any case, that's kind of what I was thinking of because I'm sure that Gwenon and Evola both have written about this is just me agreeing with you, have written about
Yeah,
the bad version of longevity, which is ritualism and kind of doing things without a good
true.
reason.
It was a degeneration into superstition and mere
Yes, yeah,
priestcraft
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
yeah, empty ritual and so forth.
yeah.
But I think it's also quite interesting, even though he's also an influence which isn't much mentioned, but Evola was also influenced by Oswald Spengler. But obviously Spengler's understanding of civilizations and typology is very, very different. Again, although he has many important insights, and Evola would have agreed with that, but that metaphysical or traditional dimension is missing, even though in many ways he was an accurate diagnostician and observer of trends and historical processes which others in his time did not notice. Anyhow, so this lack of any principle, this formlessness or amorphousness, is very much embodied in the human types, which dominates the modern world, so-called modern civilization. So the next essay discusses that, the breed of the evasive man, and this evasive man may be seen also as a kind of embodiment of the lower possibilities of human beings, and the ascendancy, again characteristic of the Kali Yuga, which is an inversion of things, but the ascendancy of the lower subordinate castes who embody the kind of feminine and earthy or telluric or chthonic tendencies, as opposed to the higher castes, which are of a heavenly and Uranic nature. The breed of the evasive man uses the term breed. And he connects this again with the state. An analogy has been drawn since ancient times between the human being and the larger organism of the state. The traditional conception of the state, a conception both organic and complex, has always reflected the natural hierarchy, so again, the castes, right, of faculties which distinguishes the complete human being. Here, the purely physical and corporeal element is supported by life's forces, which are governed by the life of the spirit and character, while above the whole being stands the spiritual and intellectual principle, which the Stoics referred to as the inner sovereign. It uses a Greek term here, the hegemonikon. And that's from the Greek root from which we also get the English word hegemony. So the hegemonikon, a kind of internal sovereign. So next he denounces democracy, not surprising. Bearing these points in mind, every democracy necessarily appears as a regressive phenomenon, a system in which every normal relationship is inverted. A system in which what? Well, the hegemonikon is completely absent, it's completely non-existent. There is no center. There is a lack of center. I think that's interesting in the light of what we just read about the Copernican understanding versus the geocentric understanding. This revocable pseudo-authority at the service of what lies below, i.e. of the purely material, social, economic, and quantitative aspect of a people, corresponds, according to this analogy, to the situation in an individual being of a mind and a spiritual principle, which exists solely on account of and for the sake of bodily needs. So democracy is a sign for Evola of something far more serious than a mere degeneration in the political domain. In fact, it is what he calls the mistake and foolish infatuation of a society digging its own grave. So he sees democracy and the kind of life which it gives rise to as, in the long run, something which will inevitably exert a regressive and a downward influence on everything, including, but not limited to, but including, this is what he wants to focus here, the personality of man. So here he really wants to look at what kind of a human type emerges from this regressive tendency embodied in the democratic form of political organization. Confirmation of this idea may be found by examining various aspects of contemporary society. Plato has stated that those who have no master within themselves, no hegemonikon, even that's a Stoic idea, no master within themselves, at least ought to have a master outside them. Well, do we have that situation today? No, we certainly do not. And democracy, particularly in America, is particularly characterized by the notion of liberation, of freedom. But this liberation and this freedom, according to Evola, amounts to nothing but the elimination of any inner form in the human personality, any sort of character, and any kind of rectitude. Very important term, rectitude. What we find, Evola says, in other words, is the decline or absence of the individual of that central power, which I have already referred to with the evocative classic denomination of hegemonikon. This does not apply to the ethical sphere alone. So let there be no mistake here. He's not just talking about a decline in ethics, but also to the field of common behavior. And what one might think of as almost indifferent, ethically speaking, forms of behavior or instances of behavior, of what he calls individual psychology and of one's existential structure. The result is the spread of an unstable and formless type, what may well be described as the breed of the evasive man. Now he says that he could describe this at great length. It's out of the, and certainly he doesn't have the space to do that. He's just going to look at some very basic aspects of this breed of the evasive man. The type of man, he tells us, belonging to this breed not only cannot stand any inner discipline and hates the prospect of facing himself, but he is also incapable of taking any serious commitment, of following a well-defined line of conduct, of showing any character, because he lacks all rectitude. There is no hegemonikon. Well, you can see that this evasive man, this breed of evasive man, is very clearly completely opposed to the heroic man, the man characterized by a hegemonikon, by rectitude, by form, by limits. He is within himself, the heroic man, a cosmos rather than a chaos. He does not shirk his responsibility. He is not afraid of serious commitment. He does not flee from inner discipline. He faces himself. The evasive man is opposite, is opposed to all of these noble and heroic qualities. And this is unfortunately a situation which is very widespread. It has engulfed the whole world. Evola makes the observation that it's interesting to note that this feebleness of the evasive man is not always of the unscrupulous, self-serving sort. Typical of the kind of man who says, in this age one cannot afford to show any character. In many cases, the behavior of people in question is even detrimental to them. It is significant, moreover, that the shattered type of individual I am talking about is increasingly taking root both in places that were the least suited to it in terms of race and tradition. Of course, he has in mind Central Europe and the Nordic countries, and to some extent Britain, as well as among certain classes, such as the aristocracy and the artisan class, whose members until just recently still preserved a certain inner form. So this spread of the breed of the evasive man cuts across, and in fact is a kind of disease maybe, or contagion, which has infected many people, even places where you would think it, according to him anyhow, it should not have. And so I think there is, although he doesn't discuss this in any detail here, his notion of a kind of inner spiritual caste and spiritual kind of notion of race, because Evola, despite what we're going to read in the next essay, had a view of race which was not purely biological. So I can't help but think that that also somehow applies here. He talks about the complete and total decline of honor among human beings, and he gives the example of professional honor, the kind of honor that you would find among people in the practical field in terms of craftsmen. He talks about guilds, but not just that. The honor, he says, which in the practical field represented a valuable expression of one's moral conscience, as well as a degree of nobility. That sense of honor, he says further down the page, which in former times distinguished even the humblest guilds. So this is not merely a moral and ethical thing. And as someone who is interested in the heroic type, Evola is concerned with honor and justice rather than the more sort of conventional bourgeois Protestant Christian notions of love, mercy, and forgiveness. He's interested in honor and justice, rectitude, duty. So he elaborates on this, saying that, as already noted, the phenomenon does not concern the moral sphere alone. Feebleness, evasiveness, light-hearted irresponsibility, and casual unfairness are also displayed in relation to trivial, everyday matters of life. One promises something, and then he gives examples: to write, to phone, to take care of this or that, and then fails to act on it. One is not punctual. In more serious cases, memory itself is affected. Forgetfulness, absent-mindedness, a difficulty to concentrate. Specialists have noted that the young generations have a poorer memory, and various bizarre adjunct reasons have been invoked to explain this fact. But the real cause actually lies in the aforementioned alteration of the overall climate, which would appear to be leading to a genuine alteration of people's psychological makeup. I think that's a crucial observation. And the fact that he noticed this years ago, I think, is extremely impressive. Indeed, we find people today incapable of keeping up simple commitments unless there are sanctions of a legal or financial nature involved. So people will keep up their commitments and so forth when it involves relations with their boss and their coworkers, because it concerns their immediate salary or their pursuit of the chimera of career. But most human relationships today are characterized by, to me in any case, a glaring banality and superficiality. And this lack of a sense of honor and commitment is palpable. And one experiences it every day in innumerable indignities that are visited upon a person of the heroic bent of mind. As someone who has been involved in education for some decades now, I have observed a tremendous decline in the quality of students. And it's shocking that Now, part of this has to do with the decline in pedagogy and teaching and education, but this notion of memory that he's talking about. People nowadays, many students do not take notes. They passively absorb. Or if the professor, I've seen this in my own teaching, that when I would write something on the whiteboard, more and more students are now not even bothering to take notes. They just take a photo of it with their phone or their iPad. And people who often do take notes during lecture, they're doing this note taking not really in what I would call the classical method, but by typing it on a laptop. Now, the fact is that if you actually write with a pen, there is a more tactile kind of full body involvement of body, mind, and soul. In other words, the whole psychosomatic pneumatic complex, body, soul, and spirit are involved in the absorbing of that knowledge. And there is a tremendous decline also in people's memory. And I think that the cell phone has contributed to this. So most people nowadays do not know how to drive around the city in which they live or to get around especially if it's driving. If you're walking, maybe I'm not quite sure. Although Google Maps has walking routes as well for people who live in very pedestrian heavy places, I suppose, like New York City. But more and more people have no idea how to give directions. They all rely on the app, the algorithm. People don't remember phone numbers. I remember back in the day, you had to remember your own, maybe they know their own phone number, but then they just take somebody's number and it's in the phone and it's referenced there by name. So you don't have to remember any telephone numbers. Maybe people memorize their passwords, but beyond that, what do they really know by heart anymore? And of course, these are maybe inconsequential examples, but very consequential examples are they don't memorize texts. In every traditional civilization, there were texts which had to be memorized, and usually they were of a sacred or of a literary or of a liturgical character. Certainly true in Islam. You have to know your prayers by heart, and there's many people who know the entire Quran by heart, and they know pages and pages of other texts. And memory is an extremely important in other religions as well, in Hinduism and definitely in Buddhism as well. From what I have experienced of Buddhism in different lands, such as in Japan and in my Tibetan diaspora in India. So I think his observations here are not only quite correct, but considering when this was written, quite prophetic. His observations on memory are also very interesting. He talks about the meaning of memory on a higher rather than a merely psychological level. Memory is, for him, closely associated with the unity of the human person, with the resistance of the human being to dispersion over time, to the flow of time as such. Memory also possesses an ethical and ontological value, which is why a particular strengthening of memory comes into play in ascetic disciplines of a higher order. Oh, as in Buddhism, for instance. He mentions Buddhism. I've forgotten that. So the evasive breed of man displays a natural tendency towards lying, often gratuitously so, for no real reason. This is one of its specifically, he says, feminine traits. And if someone reproaches a man of this breed on account of such behavior, he will either react with surprise, since it comes so naturally to him, or feel irked and react with a sort of huff. This is often the case when you catch politicians in lies, whether that's Trump or, Bush or Reagan, anybody. This is how they would react. And of course, lying is a prerequisite for politics today. Such a man does not wish to be bothered. With a little attention, one will easily find confirmation of this sort of neurosis within the circle of one's own social relations. I leave each person to contemplate that themselves. So he says you don't even have to discuss the world of politics. So lying is most blatant there, as I just said. And then he goes on to say, for it is all too evident just what role is played here by the breed of the evasive man, which is always the same, despite its wide range of labels and parties. Indeed, it is worth noting that those professing ideas of the right often constitute no exception, since these ideas frequently make up a separate compartment in such people with no direct contact to and no practical consequences for their actual life. So, this is maybe not so terribly profound, in as much as everyone, I think, has some experience or another of this kind of lack of principles among people today. But again, he identifies this emergence of the breed of the evasive man with the regressive and degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga, and of course the spread of democracy as a political system and a means of organizing human life around the world, and that this emergence of the breed of the evasive man is a kind of correlate or corollary to democracy, this loss of principles, this complete loss of any sense of rectitude of the hegemonicon within the human being, and therefore the erosion and coming extinction, more than likely, or at least certainly very much them becoming the minority of the I have in mind, of course, the heroic human type, and the hegemony, interestingly enough, of the breed of what he calls the evasive man. So would you like to discuss anything about that?
Well, I think, yeah, you're right about how kind of prescient he was with regards to noting the changes in memory. And I think this will go well. Even though the next essay is controversial, I think the deeper point in that essay goes very well with
Yeah.
this one, because it's talking about a certain type of character. And I think when we discuss that one, I think I'll bring it all together. But I'll just
Okay.
note for now. I'll just note for now that I notice a very good relation that and in particular a relation to a different type of thinker who is not a traditionalist, who makes a very similar point. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yes, I think you're right. I think that this this essay, the breed of the evasive man, does very nicely segue into the fourth chapter in this book. We're skipping the third, and so the third essay which we're going to discuss today, namely the highly charged the essay bearing the highly charged for most people today title of Negrified America. So I think it's important to I think it's crucial to make the point that Evola is in no sense some kind of an anti-black racist, in the sense of someone who would be a member, let's say in the United States, of the Ku Klux Klan, um, or some other such racialist or racist motivated groups which in America today are usually characterized as quote unquote white supremacist or supremacist groups or even militias. I don't think he has really anything in common with such persons and movements, which are by their very nature, if you know anything about the history of these movements in the United States and the what is known as the civil rights movement, and the clashes which took place and continue to take place, and things like BLM and so on and so forth. All of these groups, all of them, are characterized by being completely and totally non-aristocratic groups. Evola is very much an aristocrat. He is very much someone who is concerned with the heavenly religions, the principle of Uranos, the old ancient Greek word for heaven or sky, as opposed to terrestrial or earthy forces from below, the chthonic sorts of cults and tendencies that are always associated with, in the mind of Evola, the lower castes, the regressive human types. And so that's what he really means by negrified America. The emergence of a certain kind of human type in the United States. So on the one hand, that is a manifestation of the breed of the evasive man, but he also sees it as being a reflection of and analogous to tendencies which he associates with the Negro, the Black individual. Now, it's strange that nowadays that the word Negro, I think in America is probably as bad as the so-called N-word. But originally it wasn't. In the 60s, even into the 70s, Malcolm X, a very famous individual, Martin Luther King would use the term Negro. But I don't think you can do this now. If you do, you will probably be accused of using, engaging in hate speech or utilizing a racial epithet. I'm in no way doing that. I'm simply discussing this essay, so I don't want anyone to misunderstand what is happening here. And so, Evola associates all of this with that particular race. But on the other hand, and we won't really have a chance to go into all of this in this course, but Evola has a very elaborate, developed, and nuanced understanding of race. So he has a book entitled The Myth of the Blood, which is the first part of his extended investigation of the notion of race. So in this book, The Myth of the Blood, he looks at all of the racial theories in his time and in the past, even including some very strange ones, which no one would, I don't think even the most ardent anti-Black or pro-white, white supremacist racists would espouse, namely astrological notions of race, for example, in this book, the Myth of the Blood. And then this book, The Myth of the Blood, is followed up after having looked at all the different theorists of race. He espouses his own view, which he calls in a follow-up book entitled Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race, of which I do not own a hard copy. It's not easy to get one. I don't think it's sold on Amazon anymore, and you have to look around for it, and I haven't been able to get a copy, but there are PDFs floating around. So on the one hand, Evola does acknowledge that there is a biological element to race. And some of this also comes out in his Revolt Against the Modern World. But with the passage of time, and certainly in the Kali Yuga, human beings are not as biologically differentiated in that way. It is true that there's different colors and different, just very obvious biological characteristics, a particular hair color, for example, or style of hair, or height, skin pigment, eye shape, etc. Other features of the physical makeup of human beings. But originally, this very obvious biological, and which you can directly see, differentiation would have been accompanied by a differentiation on the level of the personality as well. That has eroded, according to Evola. And so it's not as meaningful anymore. And so he espouses the notion of a kind of spiritual doctrine of race. And it is for this reason, if you actually read many of the English writings, the writings of Evola that have come out in English translation, often have very detailed and interesting biographical and essays that analyze also many of his ideas. And if you read some of these intros, such as the one to the Revolt Against the Modern World, it was written by someone who actually knew Evola. He was actually taken to task by what we may call the more, shall we say, vulgar, quote unquote, theoreticians of race in his time for espousing this notion of a spiritual race, because as one of them very sort of wryly observed, that this would imply that an Aryan might be of a Jewish type, which of course ran very much against the grain of this person who attacked him for this. He was an Italian fascist. You can go and read it in the introduction to Revolt Against the Modern World. So Evola has a very different kind of understanding of race, but that's all kind of background. So let's see sort of what he means in this very controversial essay. So he begins this essay with some alarm, and these predictions turned out not to come true. So these merely contingent facts do not concern us here, simply to say that he begins this essay with some sense of alarm, saying, not long ago, the newspapers announced that according to some calculations, half of the population of Manhattan will be black by 1970. And in the 5 boroughs that make up the entire city of New York, 28% of the inhabitants will be of colored race. So he begins with this sort of sense of alarm. And he sees this demographic trend across other cities and metropolitan areas in the United States at the time he wrote this essay. And then he announces that, and I quote, "We are witnessing a negrification, a mongrelization, and a decline of the white race in the face of faster breeding inferior races," end quote. He then remarks that from the point of view of democracy, there's nothing wrong with this. And in fact, people of that kind of democratic sense would probably look favorably on this. I'm not sure, that would have been true in the early, 40s and 50s, but it's certainly true now. At any rate, this tendency toward racial integration and what he calls interracial social fraternization, he viewed with great alarm. And he, in no uncertain terms, denounces the calls for what he calls the quote-unquote Negro to have free access to any public and political office, so that we may even expect in the future a black president of the United States. So he would not have been surprised by the election of Mr. Obama. So we can, leave behind these sort of observations, very much of a contingent nature of his at the time he wrote this. And over on if we go over to page 28, he gets to the kernel. So even though he says that there are groups opposed to racial integration, especially in the American South, he says that these groups who are opposed to this racial fraternization and mixing and integration have failed, in the view of Evola, to realize the extent of the phenomenon of what he calls quote unquote negrification of the United States as already being well underway. On page 28, he says, and I quote, "They fail to see the extent to which America is, quote unquote, negrified," Evola's words, "not only racially and demographically, but above all in its civilization, in the behavior and tastes of the Americans, even when there has been no actual mixing with Negro blood," end of quote. On the next page, on page 29, he talks about how the United States has often been characterized, and indeed continues to be described as, a melting pot. In other words, the image is of a place where people can come to from all corners of the world, where immigrants come and mix, and then although he doesn't use this phrase, are alchemically processed into one and the same kind of human type. Let us quote his words. Evola says, I quote, "It actually presents us with a case in which a human type of largely uniform and constant characteristics was formed from out of a highly heterogeneous raw material. Emigrating to America," continues Evola, "men of the most diverse peoples receive the same imprint. After 2 generations, except in rare cases, they lose almost all of their original characteristics, reproducing a type which is fairly homogeneous in terms of mentality, sensibility, and behavior. The American type," end of quote. Next, he really, obviously, he's identifying this human type and this melting pot as, you know, the regressive influence being that of the black race. And he states further down on page 29 that had things been different, had indeed the indigenous aboriginal population of the United States of America, the Amerindian population, which he quotes with approval of Fritjof Schuon of having characterized as beings of an aquiline and solar nature. He states that had these influences been dominant in the so-called melting pot, things would have been much better. So not only this, what he calls the quote-unquote Negro element, but also, he says, in this melting pot, there is also the Puritan Protestant component, which in turn, as a result, this is Evola's words on page 29. Let's read it properly. Page 30. And I quote, "Instead, besides its Puritan Protestant component, which in turn, as a result of its fetishistic emphasis on the Old Testament, possesses many Judaized degenerate traits, it seems that precisely the Negro element in its primitivism has set the tone in important aspects of the American psyche," end quote. And here he remarks, again, I think he was very prescient here without making any value judgment, but simply observing cultural trends. I think he was very prescient because he remarks that what is characterized as American folklore does not in any way refer to the original inhabitants of the country, but in fact, more often than not, is associated with American blacks. And he cites the example of something called Porgy and Bess. I think this is a musical, and the author of this was a Jewish composer named George Gershwin, and that Porgy and Bess deals exclusively with blacks as or Black American, excuse me, folklore, and Gershwin himself admitted having resided for some time among American Black communities while he prepared this work known as Porgy and Bess. So he's referring to these elements of folklore, what today we would call American popular culture, and he identifies as a particularly reprehensible element of this culture the music of the time, namely jazz. He says, and I quote, "American civilization can be called a civilization of jazz, i.e. of negrified music and dance," end quote. In this domain, Evola continues, very singular elective affinities have led America by way of a process of regression and primitivism to imitate the Negroes. Assuming there is a need for frenzied rhythms and forms as a legitimate compensation for the mechanical and materialistic soullessness of modern civilization, one would have done much better to look to the many sources available in Europe. We have elsewhere mentioned, for example, the dance rhythms of Southeastern Europe, which have something truly Dionysian about them, But America has chosen to imitate the blacks and the Afro-Cubans, and from America, this contagion has gradually spread to all other countries, end quote. Now, he does not mention rock and roll. He singles out jazz, and he lived before the time of I believe it's called hip hop and rap, and these are very much forms of music that originate in the African American community. And in the case of rap, I think it's very striking as well, in as much as rap has also become a form that has engulfed the world. You have people who do rap in Mandarin Chinese. You have rappers in Cantonese. You have rappers in Malay. You have rappers in different dialects of Arabic. It's very strange. And so this culture of sort of, African American gangs and hoodlums and drug dealers and pimps, and that is really what is glorified in original classical so-called rap music, has engulfed the world. And then a particular sort of style of dress, these puffy jackets and these very peculiar and characteristic caps, and a certain style of trainers or athletic basketball shoes, pants which are hanging in a certain way below the waist. I think you understand. I think most people are aware of this kind of style and where it originates from. Again, without making any value judgment, but it would seem that in this regard as well, Evola was more than prescient. He of course only singles out jazz. Obviously, these other things which we have mentioned were after his time. There's a very striking, maybe even shocking quote from the famous psychologist Carl Jung, which also backs or is cited as a kind of evidence for what Evola is advancing. It's a long quotation. I will not read it. Suffice it to say, excuse me, Evola identifies this downward regressive trend in the United States with negrification, as he calls it, with a kind of regressive movement and emergence of primitivist tendencies of a telluric and chthonic nature. But there's another dimension, and that is the brutality of Americans. And this he develops directly from the quote from Jung. On page 33, and I quote, "That brutality, which is unquestionably characteristic of Americans, can well be said to have a Negro character," end of quote. He continues to allude to his observations and experiences of the Second World War, what Eisenhower, he says, was not ashamed to call the crusade in Europe. So he speaks of how he witnessed in the days of occupation, the Americans in Europe, their occupation in Europe, the forms of brutality which he witnessed. And then he says something very interesting. He says that sometimes white Americans went even further in brutality. They were even more brutal than their quote unquote Negro comrades, as he calls them, whose, and I quote, "whose infantilism, however, they often shared," end of quote. So this taste for brutality, he believes, is ingrained in the American mindset. Here he cites the example of boxing. This, of course, can be extended to many other areas now. There is a complete and total acceptance of gratuitous violence in American films. It's almost expected. There is gratuitous violence in American video games. There is gratuitous violence in American life on a day-to-day basis. Now, is that something which we can blame only on Black people? Or is this something which is characteristic of African Americans alone? I find, this is my opinion I'm stating here, I find a lot of what he is saying here hard to accept. Where was the Negro element, as he puts it? Maybe I'm getting ahead of this. Maybe I should say this until the end, but just came to mind now. Where was the so-called Negro element, as he would have called it, the element of negrification? Again, his term, the term which he would have used, in the brutality of the Civil War. As the first sort of mechanized war, it's white people fighting white people. Where is that element again in the doctrine of manifest destiny and the complete and total genocide which was practiced against the American Indians? There's plenty of brutality to go around. There was no huge so-called, Negro, as he calls it, population in Britain, but Britain was an extremely brutal empire. Where was the Negro element, as he would have called it, in the Opium Wars? I find this really hard to swallow, a lot of this. But anyway, let's finish the discussion. Let's finish this before we go to the discussion. And here, he characterizes, he gives the example of brutality. For brutality, he mentions boxing, and he contrasts boxing to the so-called supposedly noble European tradition of dueling. All right, that's fine. And then he says that modern Western man, on page 34, is, and I quote, to a large extent a regressive type, and is comparable in various respects to a crustacean. He is as hard on the outside as a man of action, as an unscrupulous entrepreneur, as an organizer, and so forth, as he is soft and formless in his internal substance. Now, this is true to the highest degree of Americans, who represent the degenerate Western type carried to its extreme. But here we find another of their affinities with the Negro: inconsistent sentimentality, banal pathos, especially in love affairs, put Americans much closer to Negroes than to truly civilized Europeans. So again, this is rather peculiar, I think. I think there's plenty of brutality to go around. It certainly doesn't mean that Black Africans on the continent of Africa are angels. There's plenty of brutality to go around, as I said. Then he makes some odd remarks about sex, which I'm not going to mention on page 34. And then on page 35, he identifies what he calls, the foolish pride of Americans. And these are his words. He says that this foolish pride of Americans, and I quote, Evola's words, not mine, reek of the Negro psyche, end quote. So the whole essay has this quality, and he seems to be oscillating between, he identifies, rightly so, I think, very reprehensible elements of the human type, which is dominant in the United States. But he seems always to either want to, well, he doesn't necessarily say it all comes from the Black Americans. He does say that where he introduced the melting pot idea. And in other instances in the essay, he's content simply to note, for example, brutality, but then say that it resembles the quote unquote Negro type or flavor or style, for want of a better term, of brutality. And he concludes on this whole note of brutality with a quotation from someone named James Burnham, who wrote a work called The Struggle for the World, and the details about him is given in footnote number 20 on page 38. He says, quoting Burnham, these are Burnham's words in quotation marks, "There is in American life a strain of callow brutality. This betrays itself no less in the lynching and gangsterism at home than in the arrogance and hooliganism of soldiers or tourists abroad. The provincialism of the American mind expresses itself in a lack of sensitivity toward other peoples and other cultures. There is in many Americans an ignorant contempt for ideas and tradition and history, a complacency with the trifles of merely material triumph. Who, listening a few hours to the American radio, could repress a shudder if he thought that the price of survival of a non-communist society would be the Americanization of the world? And unfortunately, to a certain extent, this is already happening." Great. Yes. I don't think that the brutality of Americans at home and abroad is a matter of dispute. There's plenty of violence. There's plenty of gun violence. There's all sorts of violence in the United States. American the military armed forces have committed all sorts of heinous crimes. Really, they should be war crimes, but they're never prosecuted. What did we see in WikiLeaks? We saw people being machine gunned to death. How many times have innocent people been murdered by drones? The use of nuclear weapons not once but twice in the Second World War. The My Lai massacre, the use of biological defoliants in the Vietnam War. My God, the list just goes on and on and on and on. But then how is that somehow common with the so-called Negro, as Evola would have said? I mean, I don't find in the history of Black Africa any comparable level of brutality. I think he's wrong on this. I think this is very much a manifestation of the Western world. And again, these degenerative and corrosive forces of the Kali Yuga have very much their origin in the West. I mean, the whole notion of conquest and imperialism in its modern form, it comes from the West. So anyway, that's my take. I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, so I think I can kind of maybe put a balance, or like kind of think about maybe try to explain what Evola is saying in a different way. On one hand,
Sure, I'd love to hear it.
well, yeah, I think the main gist of the essay is about going against, you use that word before, the telluric kind of people. That is what he identifies the Negro with in the American context. So for example, if he was doing an analysis of Soviet Russia, he wouldn't specify it to a race. He might say the kind of biological character of the revolutionary communists. He might say something like that. That their mindset influenced Russia to become more brutal and more, in that era of in that area of Soviet Russia. So with America, though, I think he does make, I think it's kind of the reason why he chose America is for this particular focus of the essay is because of well, I guess one, it's easier to identify, but two, it's because I think somewhere in the essay he noted that the root of why he, I guess, the root of why the Africans are like that is because he says in their tribal origins, they are a people kind of like not really concerned with history. So like if we have an example of a people who are, we had the example before of a civilization that conquers time. Okay, that's the historical civilizations.
Yeah.
That conquers space, which is the modern one. Okay, and then I guess you would characterize those tribal societies as not concerned with history or space because they always just stay in a kind of static, I guess, stable state. They can be suited, they stay in their kind of smaller social structure and just exist in the tribal situation. But that is very important, I think, because in that Young quote, the last sentence is like, he said that America reminds him of like a village where everyone's talking, and all of that, and he kind of resists to be quiet. But but all these links link together for me because it seems to say that what is the character of the lower caste, it will be something like what he's describing negrification as, or the evasive man. It will be something like this, where their virtue, where uh their the propagation of their mindset brings into clarity the fact that virtues are imposed by the warrior and the Brahmin or spiritual caste.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, for me, this was a good essay, even though the other examples, like you said, are a bit weird, because
Yeah.
it reminds me of two thinkers. Um,
Okay.
well, one is Nietzsche, who had the similar idea in genealogy of morals, I think, which is like, this is connected to evasive man too, which is like, people are naturally more similar to the evasive man, and it takes a higher type of man to teach them to keep promises and all of that. Nietzsche believed this theory that in history, certain types of higher peoples or higher castes had to teach things like having a good memory
Right.
and
The Overman. Yeah.
yes, the yeah. But is yeah. So and this is, but he's talking about his idea of what prehistory looks like. So
Mhm.
he posited that in prehistory there were a dominant caste who taught memory and keeping promises and all that to people who are like the evasive man. So Nietzsche believes that evasive man is like the base nature of humans that has to be overcome. So that's one area of what I think Evola is kind of getting at too in both of the essays, evasive man and negrification. But more importantly, or more not importantly necessarily, but more kind of outside of this field, but kind of converges on what Evola is talking about, is the thinker Marshall McLuhan, who is
Mhm.
he himself was religious, but his philosophy is all secular, and it's discussing technology, in particular media and communications technology. And this is, like Evola's also discusses media in this essay. But what McLuhan noted is that certain types of media that are certain media basically can change the way people think. So his McLuhan's thesis was that, just like what Jung said, was that certain types of media popular in America and eventually popular all over the world lead to more of a village uh, type of environment, which is, and he coined the term global village, which is what he used to describe kind of a type of
Okay.
globalization.
Okay.
So the consequence of this type of globalization is what Jung observed, which is that people are kind of easily distracted, or talking about this new thing, this that new thing. And part of why I was attracted to the alchemical processing idea, it's another realm of convergence with this, which is
Mhm.
to say that this is all to say that these different thinkers from these different fields can come to a similar conclusion, which is that whether it's from technology or from a spiritual degradation, which is more Evola's point of view,
Yes.
yeah, whatever field they're coming from, they can come to a certain agreement that from what they all observe, there are certain common traits common to this modern society that resemble certain things like an African village, to say. So it's kind of going back to a degraded mode in the sense that Evola is talking about. So I think, and so
Mhm.
he might not even, it doesn't have to be isolated to an African tribe specifically that possesses these characteristics. If
Mhm.
he looked at another primitive society, he might find the same thing. So but what's kind of counterintuitive is that modern society can resemble the most primitive society in another way. So
Yeah.
it's going, so you
Right.
think you're going forward, but really you're going back. So that's the big idea that I liked a lot.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's an interesting interpretation. I missed that. I should go and read it again with that kind of yeah, keeping that Marshall McLuhan concept in mind. I think that's really creative. That's really interesting. That's really good. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I think his main book is The Medium is the Message, and he goes into ideas of like why oral culture produce a certain civilization, why written culture produce a certain civilization. So
Mhm.
to make it, to be like as concise, his theory was that a more oral culture will be a more village like culture. So like, and then he would kind of lump together TV and radio as oral. So
As oral, okay.
that's his big idea, yeah.
I
Because
mean,
it's like
I haven't read. Have you read those works of McLuhan? I've
uh
never read him. I mean, he's a well-known name, but I've never seen. I never saw. I've never even seen a copy of his book, much less read it. So
yeah, I've listened to some of his videos because he did like interviews and stuff. And yeah, mostly got the ideas from there. But the book is about those topics, definitely.
yeah, I think I really should look at that because there's another. I mean, he's not. I don't think he's relevant to this discussion, but another kind of diagnostician of the modern world was Lewis Mumford.
Hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with him. Yeah, Mumford
No,
is
no.
very, very interesting. He wrote
Mhm.
a lot about the city. He
Right.
wrote a number of works. He has like a trilogy. Um, anyway, just look him up. I
Sure.
don't want to get the book titles wrong. But I think there's similarity between him and McLuhan. But see, you think you're onto something here with this Marshall McLuhan notion of the village and orality. If that's, yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And we learned something. That's very good. Thank you. So
All
I don't
right.
know. Do you have anything else to add? Shall we wind it up?
Yeah, we can go on.
We can go on.
Oh, no, sorry. I thought you wrap it up, right? Sorry.
Yeah. No, if you don't have anything else to add, we can wrap it up and then
Yeah. Yeah.